Well, we noted that there were all sorts of different ways to understand the exception clause in Matthew's gospel. And what I want to do, first of all, is to go back through those different views and see how we should evaluate them. Actually, before I do that, I should, I talked about this briefly yesterday. I think it is worth repeating. The basic rule in Matthew 19:9, or the basic teaching, without the exception clause, is that if someone divorces his wife and marries another woman, he commits adultery. And we said we need to explain why that's so. And we went back to the definition of adultery. Adultery means you're married to one person, but you have sex relations with someone else who you're not married to. And once you are married to someone, you have committed your life to that person, to be faithful to them, to put that relationship as having highest priority in terms of your human relations. And so a bond is established by God, a marital bond is established by God through your commitment to one another. And as long as that marital bond is intact, none of us, in God's eyes, has a right to divorce. So obviously we wouldn't have a right to remarry. So evidently, what Jesus is teaching must mean, the basic teaching without the exception clause, is that if you divorce your wife, but you do it for some reason that doesn't actually break that marital bond with her, and then you marry someone else, well, then you commit adultery. That should be clear to see why. You're doing something that even though the law says you're no longer married, God says you're married. And of course, adultery is being married to one person and having sex relations with another person to whom you're not married. So if there's going to be some way to, from God's perspective, justify a divorce, there's going to have to be something that happens in that first marriage that actually breaks the marriage bond with that first spouse. And of course, if the marriage bond is broken with that spouse, you can then divorce them and you can then remarry. At least it would seem that that's the case. But surely you can't do anything further if the marriage bond with your first spouse is still intact. Now, even if something happens during your married life that would break the marriage bond, you are not required to divorce that spouse. You are permitted, assuming you think that there is a ground for divorce, but you know, we all know from having been here throughout this week that there's a world of difference between the morally obligatory and the morally permissible. Nothing that Jesus says in this passage or anywhere else says that if something happens to break the marriage bond, you must divorce. Well, then, are you supposed to continue in the marriage even though the bond is broken? Well, you may decide that you want to continue anyway and recommit to one another and reconstitute that marital bond to make it stronger. But that's the basic logic. And if there's an exception to the basic rule, it is an exception, or it would be an exception, because something happened that did, in God's eyes, break the marital bond. And if in God's eyes the marital bond is broken, then a divorce would not be another sin. it would be permissible. And if the marriage bond in the original relationship is broken and you are divorced, then you would think that by marrying someone else, you'd forge a different marriage bond, but not one that would commit adultery against your first marriage, because the marriage bond there and the commitments that you made in that marriage have been broken and you have separated. Okay, so that's the basic logic of how this would work. That still doesn't prove that there's any ground for divorce or anything yet that breaks the marriage bond. Well, I think we can pretty quickly lift the fog on whether it's possible to break a marriage bond by anything. The answer is obviously yes. Death breaks the marriage bond. I know it's really romantic and easy to think that I love my wife so much, I love my husband, I just can't imagine not being married in heaven. But Scripture says they neither give in marriage or take in marriage. They don't have children. They're like the angels. And I thought, okay, I have to accept Jesus' testimony, but I think I'll be hanging around my wife through eternity quite a bit. You know, we'll probably do a lot of things, go a lot of places together. But my point being that there's at least something that can break the marriage bond, and that's death. Now, what we're trying to figure out is there anything else that would break the marriage bond? The no divorce positions say no, there's nothing else that would break the marriage bond once it's established. But let's look at these views to see how likely it is that they interpret the exception clause correctly. The first one of them is the inclusivist view, and you have on the screen before you how the verse would read if, in fact, this interpretation were taken. And actually, this view we can do away with pretty quickly on a very simple ground, namely a grammatical point. Remember, we said that the phrase in question is me, epi, porneia. Well, the fact of the matter is, me, and especially me with epi, is a strong form of exclusion, not inclusion. So this view that says Jesus is giving a rule and he wants to be sure that he includes something just goes contrary to what the grammar is and what it means when you use the word may. So the inclusivist view is very, very unlikely. Now the second view, the preteritive or the no comment view, we've got to talk about this one a good bit further because it involves several things. Not only is the basic idea that Jesus is not going to comment on the intramural debate within Judaism between the Hillel and the Shammai, but it also means if he's not going to comment on that debate, remember that debate was over the meaning of ervat devar in Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. So one of the most fundamental things about this view is that it assumes that porneia is the same thing as ervat devar. And of course, if that's wrong, then we're in deep trouble, or at least this view is in deep trouble. So where do we begin? I think the place to begin is to find out whether porneia is the same thing as ervat devar. And it would help in our understanding of Deuteronomy 24 to figure out what ervat devar is talking about. So if you want to turn back to Deuteronomy 24, we'll just read the verse to refresh our memory again. If a man, Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, if a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent, that translates ervat devar, about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, so on and so forth. And as we said yesterday, major debate by the time of Jesus as to what ervat devar meant, because the Pharisees were reading Deuteronomy 24, verse 1, not as a description of things that were happening, but as a prescription that gave license and warrant for them to come up with a ground for divorce. And the question was, could the ground for divorce be any old thing that happened to displease the husband? Barrenness was frowned upon in the ancient Near Eastern cultures, but other things as well, even things that we would all, I think, I'm sure all of us would think are really quite trivial. Okay. How do we test? I would propose to you the place to begin is to figure out what ervat devar likely means. And how would you go about doing that? Well, it seems that you're not going to get much help by looking at the Hebrew, by doing a lexical study. This is a phrase that is general enough and ambiguous enough as to cover a number of different possible things. And anyway, the lexical study, the word study, only shows you possible things it could mean. It's the context that tells you or shows you what it must mean in this place. But that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. I would suggest to you that the way forward on this is to suggest various things that ervat devar might mean, and see if that is supportable both by Deuteronomy 24 and by anything else we know in Scripture. So let's start out where I think a lot of us might be inclined to start. Let's imagine that ervat devar refers to adultery. That was the Shammai position, right? Okay. Now, in the Mosaic law, what did it say you're supposed to do to people who commit adultery? Stone them to death. Execute them. Well, then there's something really odd here, isn't there? If a man marries a wife who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent, we're saying adultery, about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends it. Wait a minute. If he finds that she's committed adultery, he's not supposed to give her a bill of divorce, send her from the house, and then she's making wedding plans for a second marriage. People who are supposed to be dead, you don't normally call in a wedding planner. You contact the undertaker. Okay, so I guess ervat devar probably can't be adultery, because if it is, then that makes Deuteronomy 24 actually contradict Deuteronomy 22. Deuteronomy 22 discusses adultery, and it says you execute the adulterers. So why would Moses 2 chapters earlier say execute adulterers, and now say, help them to a wedding planner? Now, that's not likely. Well, let's try something else. Could ervat devar be homosexuality, homosexual acts, lesbian acts? The Old Testament does talk about such things. But what does it say you're supposed to do with someone who engages in this kind of lifestyle? Yeah. They say colloquially nuke 'em. No, you execute them. So again, if somebody who's engaged in those kinds of activities is supposed to be executed, why are we talking about options for a second marriage and things of that sort? Okay, so it's not likely to be homosexuality or lesbianism. Well, let's see. Could it be that Ervat Devar refers to incest? It turns out, you get married and you thought that this was a distant relative or no relative at all, and you wind up that genetically, or you figure out that family-wise, the two spouses are a lot more closely related to one another than you thought, or probably you would know that in that culture, because everybody in that culture would probably know everyone else's business. I mean, talking about way back in the times of Deuteronomy 24. What does the Mosaic law say you're supposed to do with people who commit incest? Stone them to death, right? So again, that doesn't fit with what we're seeing here in Deuteronomy 24. Well, what about, maybe what it means is having sex relations with an animal, bestiality. Mosaic law talks about that. But what are you supposed to do with those folk? Stone them to death. So, okay, it can't be that. Well, there's not a whole lot, if any, other sexual type of sin that is involved, that could be involved. So the idea that Ervat Devar refers to something sexual, that's probably not what it means. Which means, ironically, doesn't it, that the Hillel, who basically wanted to say it means any and everything that a husband might find disagreeable about his wife, they were probably more right about the meaning of Ervat Devar than the Shammai, who had the stricter interpretation of the law. It seems then that Ervat Devar most likely is something non-sexual. It's something else. Well, now, if you have a marriage bond established with your spouse, and one morning she comes down to breakfast in curlers and you don't like that, or she burns your meal, or she hasn't been able to give you any children, would any of those things break the marital bond that you established when you committed your life to her? No. Are any of those things punishable by execution? No. Oh, okay, so that also fits with the idea that if someone is divorced on grounds of Ervat Devar, it makes sense to talk about and think about them marrying again, because they've not committed any deed that would require executing them. Well, okay. Then if Ervat Devar is not something that breaks the marriage bond, and if Ervat Devar is the same thing as porneia, which this no comment view requires, then let's see how that works. If you come back to Matthew 19 and you look at verse 9, including the exception clause, and let's put aside the no comment aspect of this for right now, and let's see how this works. We understand that the basic rule, if anyone divorces his wife and remarries, he commits adultery. The only way that can make sense is that he divorces her for some sort of reason that doesn't break the marriage bond, right? Lo and behold, that sounds an awful lot like the stuff we were talking about when we just a moment ago said, here's probably what ervat devar refers to. It's something that doesn't break the marriage bond. Well, then if ervat devar is porneia, then the exception clause is redundant in Matthew 19:9, isn't it? The rule is if you divorce your wife, presumably on the grounds of ervat devar, which doesn't break the bond, and you marry another, you've committed adultery. Well, why then would you say if you divorce your wife on grounds that don't break the marital bond, except in cases where something happens that doesn't break the marital bond and you remarry, you've committed adultery? That doesn't make sense. The exception clause would be redundant, right? So remember, regardless of what you do with the whole exception clause, right now we're trying to figure out what porneia, what that part of it actually means. Now, so far we've been considering the option that porneia is equivalent to ervat devar, and that ervat devar, I think we're pretty safe in saying that's not something sexual, it's not something that is going to break the marital bond. If, on the other hand, porneia is something that would break the marital bond, then the verse with the basic rule plus the exception clause doesn't become redundant, right? The rule would be if you divorce your wife on a ground that doesn't break the marital bond and remarry, you commit adultery. We understand why. Now add the exception clause where porneia is not equivalent to ervat devar, but it is something that would break the marital bond. Then the sentence reads, if you divorce your wife, except when you do it on the ground of something that would break the marital bond and remarry, you commit adultery. But now how do would that make any sense? Sure it would. Would it be redundant of the basic rule? No. So there's another line of evidence, even if you don't think this is a genuine exception to no divorce, at least reading it so that porneia means something different than ervat devar does make sense, and it is not redundant. Now, right now, I don't think we have to decide what porneia means. We'll come to that a little bit later. All we needed to do was to see what ervat devar meant and if it could possibly mean the same thing as porneia, and I trust that you're convinced by this point that it can't. If it does, then Matthew 19:9 is redundant. The exception clause makes this a redundant sentence. Well, okay, but that's not the only thing that's going on with the no comment view, because the main idea of it is that Jesus, in the context of the Pharisees asking him to comment on Deuteronomy 24 verse 1 and the meaning of ervat devar, Jesus refuses to say anything about that. So what we had better do, class, correct? Listen to what we had better do is to see whether, in fact, in Matthew 19, Jesus does not comment about whether you can divorce your wife for any and every cause, ervat devar. Is it true that Jesus makes no comment about it? It is absolutely false that he makes no comment about it. Well, how does he make comment? Well, let me show you. Verse 3, Pharisees came to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And Jesus' response, haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one. Therefore what God has joined together, let no man separate. That's answer one. What is the answer? You're focusing on the wrong issue, Pharisees. You want me to get involved in this internal debate within Judaism about the meaning of ervat devar and possible grounds for divorce, and I want to tell you that you're missing the main point that you should know about marriage. The main point is that you should know is not how to get out of it, but that it needs to be permanent. Isn't that a comment? Seems to me that it is. But it doesn't end there. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? And as you go back and read Deuteronomy 24 verses 1 and following, you see the language, give the wife a certificate of divorce and he sends her away. So, is Jesus going to say anything about that? Yeah, verse 8. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard, but it was not this way from the beginning. Isn't that a comment on what they're talking about in Deuteronomy 24? It sure is. The Pharisees are saying, if you're right, Jesus, about permanence in marriage, then why does Moses command to divorce and give the certificate of divorce? And Jesus is correcting then another misunderstanding, not only of the Pharisees, but probably a lot of other people in Jesus' day who were taking Deuteronomy 24 not as a description of a situation, but as a command to divorce, but also to be sure to give a certificate of divorcement. And now the only question was, well, what could the ground for divorce be? And Jesus corrects the most fundamentally wrong assumption that the Pharisees have, namely that Moses is commanding someone to divorce. And Jesus said, there's no command here. There's permission, but what you're permitted to do, you don't have to do. And if you would live in accord with God's high and holy law, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't act on what you're permitted to do. Is that a comment on Deuteronomy 24:1 and the debate over ervat devar? Yeah, it is, because it says you guys are looking for grounds for divorce and then saying if you have them, then you not only have a right to divorce, but Pharisees are saying Moses commands you to divorce. And Jesus is saying you're conceiving of this thing entirely wrong. Moses is not saying that anybody has to get divorced, regardless of what the reason is. Okay, so that seems to me that that's a comment. But the comment doesn't end there. Why? Well, the most telling comment, seems to me, is in verse 9, the one we're working with. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery. And we said the only way that can make sense is that he divorces her for any old reason that doesn't break the marital bond. Does that have anything to do with the debate within Judaism about legitimate grounds for divorce? You bet it does. You bet it does. It fundamentally says the Hillel view is wrong. Even if the Shammai view needs some tweaking, it's closer to the correct view about divorce and remarriage. The Hillel view is closer to the correct view about the meaning of ervat davar. But what Jesus, in effect, is saying here is, no, you cannot divorce your wife on any and every grounds, because on many grounds, if you divorce her and remarry, you commit adultery. And Jesus' listeners knew what the punishment was for adultery. So, if you know that there's a punishment, and especially if you realize how severe it is, what should you learn from that? Well, if there's going to be a punishment with this, and the punishment is one that means I should be dead, I guess that means no, I can't divorce my wife for just any and every cause. Maybe porneia would be a ground to allow me to divorce and remarry. But we've already seen that porneia isn't equivalent to ervat davar. So whatever porneia means, it can't be she's barren, she doesn't keep the house well, she burned the meal. No, what Jesus is saying is, if you divorce your wife on those kinds of grounds and marry someone else, you commit adultery. And you know what the penalty is, the punishment is for adultery. So, Pharisees, don't you get it? The answer to your question in verse 3 is no, a man may not divorce his wife for any and every cause. That doesn't sound to me like no comment. So, both on the grounds that this view requires porneia to be equivalent to ervat davar, and it clearly can't be, and on the ground that this view says the exception clause means Jesus won't comment on the debate over Deuteronomy 24, and yet we've seen that Jesus comments several times about it, this view can't be right. So let's turn to the next one. Here we can be much quicker. Now, Bible scholars are agreed, I think you'd find pretty uniformly, that whatever the exception clause means in Matthew 19, it has to mean the same thing in Matthew 5. It's the other place, Sermon on the Mount, where it shows up. Well, then that tells us that this view is in trouble, because this view works in Matthew 5, but it isn't going to make any sense in Matthew 19. So that rules that one out. Not to mention, class, that if this is correct, look at what it means that Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, well, if someone has already committed adultery, you can't make them an adulterer by divorcing them and them getting remarried. If you are already an adulteress, you can't be made an adulteress again. You don't need to be made an adulteress when you already are one. Well, yeah, in strict logic, that point is correct. That's a nice debater's point. But do you think that's really what Jesus is trying to teach? That you can't be made something if you already are it? I don't think that's what. I don't see any teaching from Jesus that is so tautological, so, quite frankly, trite. So, this is in trouble. Unchastity in the betrothal period. Now, this view and the next two no divorce positions. Remember we said, note the fact that it's only Matthew's gospel that you find the exception clause showing up in. And since that is the quote-unquote Jewish gospel, whatever the exception clause means, it has to have something to do with Jews and Jewish law. And so this refers to the point in Jewish law that after the marriage is contracted and before the couple begins to live together as husband and wife, if the wife is found to be unfaithful during the engagement period, under the Mosaic law, you could divorce your wife. And that's what Jesus is talking about when he says, except for porneia. Now, a couple of problems with this one. In the first place, you have to show something in the context of chapter 19 that says that Jesus is actually talking about the engagement period. And there's nothing in there that shows that that's what he's talking about. You say, well, maybe porneia is the engagement period. Well, you'd be hard-pressed, I think, to find a verse that talks about that legislation that says that's what porneia means, or even uses porneia to describe that. But there's more to this than just what I've said, more problems than just what I've said. Look, Matthew 19, what Jesus says, what he teaches in verse 9, is all laid out against the context of what Old Testament passage? Deuteronomy 24. That wasn't intended as a trick question. Okay, what is Deuteronomy 24 about? People who are engaged? No. It's about people who are married who get divorced. Right? Uh-oh, this view's in trouble. Because this view says that verse 9 of Matthew 19, at least the exception clause, is about people who are engaged. Why is Jesus going to bring that up in a discussion of Deuteronomy 24 that's not about engaged people, it's about people who are married and divorced and remarried? So, you know, that doesn't seem to be very likely either. Well, mixed marriage view. The thing that happened when the people of Judah went home from Babylonian captivity with their pagan wives or husbands, and the Lord was worried about keeping the integrity of the Jewish faith and the Jewish nation together, and so there was an allowance, even a request through Ezra and Nehemiah to divorce those pagan wives. That's what this is supposed to be about, according to this view. Well, if it is, there is no hint in Matthew 19 that that's what Jesus has in mind. I mean, that would make porneia mean being a pagan or an unbeliever. In other words, you can't divorce your wife and marry someone else unless you divorce her on the grounds that she's a pagan. And then you could divorce her and marry someone else. Well, I don't think you'll find any instance of porneia in Scripture referring to that, and even more specifically referring to what went on in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. So this one doesn't make any sense. And here's the other problem with this. Why would Jesus say this to people, and I'm talking about people in his own day, not talking about us, but to people in his own day? Why would he say this to people in his own day who are living 400 to 500 years after this incident? I mean, what you're really saying, Jesus, is for you guys, you better not divorce your wife and remarry and commit adultery. Unless it's for the reason that your wife is a pagan, like back in the days of, Ezra and Nehemiah. But we're not in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. So why do you include that, Jesus? It doesn't overturn the rule. Well, this is why some have said, well, it's not exactly about what happened in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. It's what's happened in the days of the early church. But hang on a minute. When Jesus says this, there isn't the early church, right? He hasn't even gone to the cross. So I grant you Jesus is omniscient, so he knows what's going to happen as Christianity begins to spread. There are going to be households where one spouse accepts Christ and the other doesn't. But his disciples and the Pharisees with whom he's having this discussion don't know any of that. So what would it mean to them to say, except for the fact that they're an unbelieving pagan? Well, that was the situation in Ezra and Nehemiah's day, but we're not living in that day. Yeah, but you're going to live a little bit further, and it's also going to be a similar situation when Christianity starts to spread after I've died, been buried, risen again, and the Holy Spirit has come on Pentecost. Look, the disciples heard Jesus say repeatedly that he was going to the cross and would rise again, and they didn't get it. Do you think they'd understand this? If it's about something that's going to happen maybe 30, 40 years in the future to a beginning church that hasn't yet really begun, that's extremely, extremely unlikely. What about this one? This one winds up being more popular than a number of others among a lot of evangelicals, especially people who had their training at some point over the last 30, 40 years at Dallas Seminary. Because this was Ryrie's view. I think it was perhaps Pentecost view, some of the other major names there. And so a lot of people who were trained under those folk have adopted this position. Now, what this is proposing is, again, it's looking back to something in Jewish law, and specifically it's looking back to the incest rules that are part of the holiness code in Leviticus 18 and 19. And another thing that, that would be something related to Jews. But in addition, there are instances in the New Testament, I've listed some of them in the chapter on divorce and remarriage, where porneia does mean incest. It's fairly likely that at least on one occasion or so, in the book of 1 Corinthians, it gets used, and it pretty clearly refers to that. So those sorts of things are part of what make this view somewhat popular among people who believe there's no divorce. Well, what should we say about this? several things here. First of all, if this is what Jesus is talking about, he surely doesn't give us much of a clue, and the passage doesn't give us much of a clue, that that's what he has in mind. You say, oh, yes, he does. He uses the word porneia. Oh, good. I'm glad you said that, because, when you do the word study on porneia, you do find that it gets used occasionally in regard to incest, but that's not the only way that Matthew or the New Testament use it. So the presence of porneia in this verse cannot be the smoking gun, so to speak, that proves the case for this view. Because doing a lexical study of New Testament use of porneia shows that incest is something that it could mean, but there are other things that it could mean. So when we know that various meanings are possible, how do we determine what's actual? We have to determine it by the context of the passage, right? And beyond the occurrence of porneia in this passage, what is there that would suggest that we're talking about incest? Nothing. Right? I mean, what word, what phrase, what question shows that that's what we're talking about here? Oh, well, it has to be something Jewish because Matthew is the Jewish gospel. Now think about that for a moment. Wouldn't that imply that if this refers to something in Jewish law, then it applies to them, but it doesn't apply to Gentiles? Which means if you marry someone and you find out that your marriage involves incest, you can divorce them. Of course, that's if you're a Jew. But if you're a Gentile and you marry someone and you find out or you know that that involves incest, don't worry. And I'm not denying that Matthew is writing predominantly to Jews. What I'm trying to show you is don't hang yourself on the Jewishness of Matthew's gospel type argument. Because if you do, you're going to have to apply that to the rest of the book, and that means that unless you're Jewish, as I am, Hebrew Christian, unless you're Jewish, close the book, it doesn't apply to you. You better read Mark and Luke and John. They're written for Gentiles. And, oh, by the way, none of those books includes the exception clause in Jesus' teaching on divorce. So for you, it's not even a contest. Well, that's not the way we handle Scripture, right? If it is, then that really lets you guys off the hook. I'm saying you guys because I think most of you are Gentiles. The Great Commission, Matthew 28, that could only apply to Jews because it's in a Jewish gospel. Be sure you don't read to the end of the book of Mark because you'll get the same kind of command. But you're off the hook at least through the end of Matthew. That kind of interpretation and use of addressees. Class, obviously, you can talk to someone and talk about someone else to someone, right? We do it all the time. So don't get misled by the fact that this gospel is directed to Jews. That doesn't mean it can't talk about things that pertain to both Jews and Gentiles. It surely can. The final problem with this view is that, let's say for the sake of argument, Jesus is referring to something in the Leviticus Holiness Code. Well, then the question is, why do you think he's referring to incest? Have you read the Leviticus Holiness Code? It talks about adultery. It talks about homosexuality. It talks about bestiality. Yeah, it talks about incest. It also talks about having sex relations with a woman during her menstrual period. How did you happen to know that out of all of those things, Jesus only meant incest? I trust that even to ask that question shows the absurdity of it. There's nothing in the context of Matthew 19 that would suggest that even if Jesus is referring to the holiness code, he has that thing in mind and nothing else in mind. So this one is in trouble. Well, let's turn to the divorce but no remarriage view. But before I do that, there's been a hand over here, my brother. I don't want to run completely past you, please.
I just had two questions. The first one was, can we interpret things in Gospels in light of that there are certain things in this Gospel that are particular Jews, however it doesn't mean that everything is just their Jews? Like when Jesus says to the man, go to offer the gift prescribed, that's something that's very Jewish, but however, that doesn't mean that everything in Matthew is only Jewish because certain things apply to Jews. And the second question is, if Jesus is saying to married people, if you divorce for sexual, if you divorce for everything apart from sexual activity outside of marriage, you commit and remarry, you commit adultery. Why wouldn't he just say anyone who divorces his wife except for adultery and marries another commits adultery? Why would he say sexual immorality? If sexual activity outside of marriage is adultery, why wouldn't he say anyone who divorces his wife except for the reason of adultery and marries another commits adultery?
Well, of course, there are a lot of people, I'm responding to the second question first. The second question is, if Jesus is wanting to give an exception and it's something sexual, why wouldn't he just say, if someone divorces his wife and marries another, except in the case where the divorce was because they committed adultery, then he commits adultery? Why wouldn't Jesus just say that? Well, there's a lot of folk who think that that's what this does mean. We're going to have to see if, first of all, we think Jesus is giving an exception to the rule. And then if it is an exception, a genuine exception, then we're going to have to say, okay, what is porneia? If that's the one thing that allows you to divorce and remarry without committing adultery, then what is porneia? We'll come back to that a bit later. Let me address your first question, though, which was also very, very important. The question was about the Jewishness of this gospel or whatever, or any other passage. And the question was, isn't it possible that certain things in the gospel are for a Jewish audience only, but that doesn't mean everything is? And the answer to that is, surely it is possible that that's so. My point is that people who take one of those last three no divorce positions tend to include in it that because this is a Jewish gospel, that tells us that this passage has to be about things in Jewish law. And the reason is this is a Jewish gospel, and their mindset is the ultimate sort of horizon of context for the whole of Matthew is that Matthew's writing to Jews to convince them that Jesus is their Messiah. So everything's got to relate to them in some way or other. Well, I think I could say, yeah, in some way or other, but don't think that means it can't be relevant to Gentiles as well. My complaint, though, of applying that, see, I think what you've said is correct. It should be possible, even in a quote-unquote Jewish gospel, that some things clearly are directed and relevant only to Jews, while other things are relevant to both Jews and Gentiles. Now the question is, what is there in Matthew 19:9 that says that's only relevant to Jews and not relevant to Gentiles? And my answer is there's nothing in it. Yep.
I guess the thing that kind of throws me off balance is if I'm a New Testament saint like the first century and I have a copy of Luke and that's it, and I have Jesus' teaching on divorce, it's just like no divorce, no remarriage, that's all I have. And then if I have Mark, same thing. And then Matthew, there's this passage is just it's different. So it's kind of like, I guess that kind of maybe that unnecessarily leads you to a bent that there must be something Jewish that maybe you shouldn't do. But if you just read other gospels, it's like, okay.
Oh, yeah. The question is, if I'm living in the first century as a Christian, and I've got access to Luke and to Mark, they don't have the exception clause, and I've got access to Matthew, and it does. What am I to make of all of that? And wouldn't I be looking for some sort of reason that the exception clause is there in Matthew and isn't in Mark or Luke? Yeah, I think you would be. Again, remember that at that point in history, the New Testament canon had not been completely written, so it surely wasn't compiled. So Christians, say in 50 AD, who knows how much access to any of this they would have had, and it wouldn't have been decided that here is the New Testament canon, so we know all of this is God's Word. But in order to at least respond to the main question you're asking, let's assume they did know that all of the Gospels were God's Word. I think they would ask the kind of question that you're suggesting. And probably they would say that, well, the fact that it is in the Jewish gospel probably means Jesus is trying to say something that would be on Jews' minds. But does that mean that he has to be picking up a point in Jewish law or Jewish history, as some of these things do? And does it mean that whatever he's saying there is relevant only to Jews and doesn't cover Gentiles? Well, Jesus gives no indication anywhere in this passage or in Matthew 5 or in any of the other Gospels that what he's saying is for Jews only. I mean, it may be generated by something that he knows his Jewish listeners would be thinking about, but he does not give any indication that what he's teaching is for and about only Jews. Now, given time constraints, let me, rather than going into a lengthy explanation of what I think Jesus, why the exception clause appears in this gospel as opposed to the other one, let me just refer you to the chapter in Ethics for a Brave New World. Under the Erasmian view, there is a discussion of why it would make sense for Jesus to do that. To say that and for Matthew to include it, and yet it's clear that nothing about this makes this only relevant to Jews and not to Gentiles, and makes this be about something really narrow in Jewish law or Jewish experience. And the other point that I would make class is this. Even if you grant that this has to be something that comes out of a point of Jewish law, what is it? We've looked at 3 different things. It can't be problems in the engagement period because this is set within the context of Deuteronomy 24, which is not about engaged people. It's about married people, divorced and remarried. It can't be about the mixed marriage situation in Ezra and Nehemiah's day, because why would that be relevant to first century Jews? And if you say, well, it's relevant to first century Christians, where the gospel spreads and one spouse accepts Christ and the other one doesn't, well, that happened in an awful lot of Gentile homes. So then that says it isn't something about Jews. Incest in the Leviticus Holiness Code, yeah, that could be it. Except that as long as you're going to make it appeal to the Leviticus Holiness Code, how did you know it was incest rather than any of the other things? And by the way, we need to be careful that we don't suggest, if we hold this view, that the Leviticus Holiness Code is what Jesus is referring to, and that's a Jewish thing, so that the Leviticus Holiness Code rules only apply to Jews and don't apply to Gentiles, which would mean that that passage does not outlaw bestiality, homosexuality, incest if you are a Gentile, only if you're a Jew. Now, surely that is not what any one of us would want to do in our reading of Leviticus 18 and 19. Okay, good questions. Let me move on. Time is flying by. The divorce but no remarriage view. Well, there's a variety of problems with this, but I think, first of all, let's remember what this says. Divorce is acceptable in cases where the ground for the divorce was porneia, but it's divorce and remarriage that equal adultery. So even in cases where you could divorce without committing a sin, you couldn't remarry. And in cases where you couldn't divorce without committing a sin, you surely couldn't remarry. So what this view says is that there is an exception to the general rule, but it says that the exception is to the ground for divorce. It doesn't apply to remarrying. So, in other words, Jesus doesn't give permission to anyone to remarry regardless of the reason for their divorce. There are some divorces, this view says, that are unacceptable, and so, of course, remarriage would be unacceptable. On the other hand, there are some divorces that are acceptable, the ones that were based on someone committing porneia. But even in that case, the people who divorce are not allowed to remarry. Okay, if you've had a chance to read the chapter, you know that this was the pretty much the consensus view among the early church fathers. So it was a very widely held view at that time. And you might say, well, what would be the point of divorcing your wife if she can't then go and marry another man? Well, the point was, if you divorce her but she can't remarry, maybe that will send her a message, And the message will be, you know, you better rethink your relationship to your husband and how you act and what you did to get him to divorce you. And you ought to repent of that and then go back to your husband and reconstitute the marriage. So with a view like this, the intent of divorcing someone, if you had a legitimate grounds to do so, was not to get them free to marry someone else, but to get the message to them, you need to clean up your act and go back to your husband. You say, well, what about, does the rule work the other way? That a wife could do that to her husband? It's not stated that way, and remember what the status of women in society is at that time. They did not have those kind of rights within Judaism at any rate. It's debatable whether under Greco-Roman law everyone living in those countries, every woman living in those countries had those rights either. But if you thought this applied to a woman divorcing her husband and he had to remain unmarried and he needed to get the message that he needed to clean up his act and then go back to his wife, well, then that's how this would apply to them as well. The basic thing is no one is allowed to marry someone else, but in some instances, a couple is allowed to get a divorce. Now, what is the problem with this view? There are a number of things that can be said, but let me, in the interest of time, get to the heart of this. Verse 9, Jesus' teaching actually is a sentence whose structure is an if-then. If someone divorces his wife and marries another, then he has committed adultery. If you've taken your Greek so far, you know that the if clause is the protasis, the then clause is the apodosis, right? Now, in an if-then sentence, how does that work? Does the then part of the sentence relate to part of the protasis or all of the protasis? All, right. Why do I even ask that? I ask it because you have a compound protasis. If a man divorces his wife and marries another, then he commits adultery. Okay? So the then clause is not saying if you divorce your wife, you've committed adultery. It says you've committed adultery when or if you both divorce and remarry. So what's the problem with this view? It fails to remember or recognize that the then part modifies comments on the whole if clause. How does it do that? It makes the then clause refer only to the first half of the protasis. If a man divorces, then he commits adultery. You say, well, but what does the exception clause do to it? Well, the exception clause is an exception to the protasis, right? Except that this view says it's only an exception to the first half of the protasis. If a man divorces his wife except for the purpose or for the cause of porneia and remarries, then he commits adultery. But the problem is the passage doesn't say that the exception, whatever it is, applies only to divorcing. It says that the exception applies to divorcing and remarrying. And then you get the punchline, the then clause, which modifies the whole process, divorce and remarries. And the problem is this view dismembers the protasis and makes the apodosis apply only to the first half. So grammatically, there's a problem. And interestingly, the people who in more recent years have most vigorously defended this view, William Heth and Gordon Wenham, in a book entitled Jesus and Divorce. This was out at least in the 70s, maybe in the early 60s as well. Thankfully, in more recent publications on this, they come out and say, we realize we were wrong. This view is not acceptable biblically. Now, there are other problems with it, but I'll let you read about those. So, what does that mean? Well, we come, if you're following me, at least you can see I can't go with any of the no divorce positions. I can't go with the divorce but no remarriage position. So I'm running out of possibilities. So obviously it's going to be one of these divorce and remarriage views, which is the Erasmian view. And there are a couple of variations in this regard. The exception clause, but the basic thing with the Erasmian view is that the exception clause grants a genuine exception to the no divorce rule. And so Matthew 19:9 does give a ground for divorce, which would mean what? It would mean that there must be something which, if it occurred, would, in God's eyes, break the marriage bond. And so if that happens, you could divorce your spouse because the divorce wouldn't break the marriage bond. The porneia already broke it. You're just formalizing that by divorcing. And if the marriage bond is broken and that's why you can divorce, then you could also remarry, constitute a marriage bond with a second spouse, and that would not be committing adultery against the first marriage because the first marriage in God's eyes is broken. Okay, so that's how this would work. As I suggest early in the discussion of Matthew 19:9, the Matthew 19, especially verse 9. Verse 9 is actually a compressed version of two separate sentences. The first sentence is the one without the exception clause, and it says, whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery. The second one says, whoever divorces his wife on the grounds of porneia and remarries does not commit adultery. Matthew and Jesus say it more concisely, but that's the logical structure of the sentence that you have in Matthew 19:9. You say, yeah, but I don't see does not commit adultery. I don't see those words in the text. No, you don't, but you do see the words me epi. That tells you you've got an exception to a general rule. Well, what is the general rule? The general rule is what the verse says without the exception clause. The exception clause overturns the rule not all the time, but in the exceptional cases. And that's important to remember, class. In ethics, you talk about ethical rules, and then you want to, once you've defined the rules, you want to figure out if there are any exceptions to those rules. And sometimes this is where people get into trouble. They think that if there are exceptions to the general rule, the exceptions throw the rule out altogether. No, they don't. The exceptions to a general rule throw out the rule only in the exceptional cases. In the non-exceptional cases, the general rule still stands. What does that mean in this case? Well, it means that if you divorce your wife on grounds that in God's eyes don't break the marriage bond, and we saw that the stuff that Ervat Devar actually would refer to wouldn't break the marriage bond, if that's the ground for divorce and then you remarry, then you commit adultery. Now, does the exception clause totally nullify that rule? No. It just says, if on the other hand you divorce your spouse because she has committed adultery and then you remarry, in that case you don't commit adultery. But in the other cases, or whatever you think porneia is, in the other cases where your spouse has not committed porneia, if you divorce her and remarry, you do commit adultery. Okay, so that's how exceptions to general rules work. They throw out the rule only in the exceptional cases. In all other cases, the general rule applies. So what that means is, the real question here is, all right, if porneia is the one ground that allows for divorce without committing sin, and hence remarriage without committing sin, what does porneia mean? Well, in our earlier discussion, we came to conclude that it couldn't mean whatever Ervat Devar does. So what are the options? Well, some say only adultery. The other view is it grants a genuine exception, and porneia is a more general term denoting various sexual improprieties. Like what? Well, like adultery, for one, but not only that. Incest would also be a sexual impropriety. So would homosexuality and lesbianism and bestiality. Well, between those two options, either just adultery or maybe a wide range of sexual improprieties, which is more likely? Well, we know that porneia, from doing a study of the New Testament, can mean a number of different things. So then the question is, what's it most likely to mean here? And thankfully, we do have some help on this. There are only 3 places in the Gospel of Matthew where the word porneia shows up. One of them is right here, and of course that's the case in question. A second one is in Matthew 5, but that's also the case in question, because that's Jesus is teaching on divorce in the Sermon on the Mount. And so neither of those are going to help us a whole lot, right? Because they are the passages that are under consideration. But you know what? Thankfully, we've got some help otherwise. The third one of these appears in Matthew 15 and verse 19. And Jesus is talking about what defiles a person, and he says it's not what goes into your mouth, into your stomach, that defiles you. It's what comes out of your mouth and come from the heart, that's what defiles you. And then he turns in verse 19 to talk about a number of things that flow out of the heart and defile someone. And look at the list. For out of the heart come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. Now, I'm sure you didn't miss the middle of that. Adultery and sexual immorality. The word that Matthew uses and that is translated adultery is not porneia, it is moikia. The next word that these translators have translated sexual immorality is porneia. So lo and behold, this is really helpful, isn't it? Because Matthew uses both porneia and moikia in the same place, and if they mean the same thing, then he's being redundant, and it's not likely that he's being repetitive. So then one of them probably refers to adultery and, Matthean usage, because you do have in Matthew, here, let me check. I've got it. But I believe that the verbal form, pornuo, doesn't get used in Matthew's gospel, but moikuo and moikao does, and those are in contexts where it gets translated as adultery and seems pretty clearly to refer to that. So, on the basis of Matthean usage here, when given a chance to use porneia and talk about something else that is sexual, he doesn't say porneia, he says moikeia, porneia. And it's clear that moikeia doesn't refer to a range of sexual improprieties. It refers specifically to adultery. So if porneia is about only adultery, then the sentence is redundant. Hence, it looks like this view of the exception clause and of the meaning of porneia is the most likely one. Okay, so what does that mean about Matthew 19:9? Well, it means then, if you adopt this view, as I do, that Jesus is saying, in effect, if you divorce your wife and marry another woman, and you divorce her on grounds, flimsy grounds, ervat devar, things that don't break the marital bond in God's eyes, then your new marriage, you commit adultery. But if you divorce your spouse on the grounds of some sexual impropriety, and you know the range of them, and you marry another, you don't commit adultery. Why? Because porneia, whatever it is, breaks the marital bond. Well, what's the marital bond? Well, remember, it's that commitment of the two partners that they will be faithful to one another, that they will forsake other relationships and cling to one another. And that's going to be their focus. Would committing some form of porneia break that promise? You bet it would. If I promise to be faithful to my wife and then I engage in sexual acts with some other man, I've broken my promise to be faithful to my wife. Now, next thing. Does this mean that if porneia has been committed, the party that did not commit it has to divorce the party who committed it? No. How do we know that? From Matthew 19:9. Here's where last Monday's discussion where we began is really, really helpful. In order for it to be required that you divorce your spouse when they've committed porneia, verse 19 would have to be a prescription, a command, right? Well, let's read it. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for marital unfaithfulness and marries another commits adultery. Any prescription there? Well, not evidently on the surface of it. Is this just a general description of things? Well, it seems a little bit more than that. It surely has ethical implications. Actually, class, verse 9 is not a command. It is Jesus' moral assessment of what you're doing if you divorce and remarry on non-biblical grounds. And it's his moral assessment of what you're doing if you divorce on biblically acceptable grounds and remarry. But assessment of what you're doing doesn't mean you have to divorce anyone. And that's also important to realize, because there's some people who say, well, the Erasmian view can't be right because it seems like that contradicts what Jesus has said in verses 4 through 6, where he says marriage needs to be permanent. That was God's command. And therefore, what God has joined together, let no man separate. That is a command. So if Jesus is saying God commands permanence in marriage in verse 6, and in verse 9, he's saying God commands divorce when porneia has been committed. There's a real problem there. But verse 9 is not a command. But verse 4 through 6 is a command. You're supposed to stay married. Yeah, and God's serious about that. But that's the command. Are there any exceptions? Well, verse 8 tells you the exception to the no divorce command. Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives. That he allowed that to happen, and he did so for a reason, because of the hardness of your hearts. But that wasn't God's original intention. Now, does the fact that God allowed an exception to the no divorce rule mean that you have to divorce when you have ground? No. Does it mean that the exception throws out the rule of permanence in marriage altogether? No, because as we said a little bit earlier, exceptions only throw out the basic rule in the exceptional cases. And in this case, the exception is not commanded, it's simply allowed. But we know, because you were here and paying attention last Monday, that there's a difference between moral obligation, you have to do that, and moral permission. You're allowed to do that, but you don't have to do what you're allowed to do. Well, there's one other thing here about verse 9 that I want you to see, and it'll set the stage for verses 10 through 12. Now, you and I are so familiar with this passage, and if you weren't before this week, I'm sure you are now. By now. We are so familiar that whether or not we've known what it means and how it works, it doesn't seem to be all that outrageous for Jesus to say, if you divorce your wife and marry another, you commit adultery. We say, yeah, I've read that many times. That's the rule. Class, this is incredible in the context in which Jesus speaks it. Why? Because in the first place, people in Judaism down through the centuries had been divorcing and remarrying left and right. And no one had ever said, you know, when you do that for certain reasons, you commit adultery. This is the first time anybody had ever said that. And what makes this incredibly devastating and astonishing is that the Jews in Jesus' day knew what the Mosaic law said you're supposed to do with adulterers and adulteresses. Stone them to death. This is pretty radical stuff that Jesus is laying on them. It seems very commonplace to us. It was not commonplace. It was utterly devastating to hear that what these people had seen throughout their lifetime was happening over and over again, and what they knew had been going on for centuries. Now someone comes forward and says, you know, this thing that you guys have been doing and your ancestors have been doing willy-nilly, you're actually committing adultery when you do that. And Jesus doesn't have to then add, and oh, by the way, remember that the Mosaic law punishes adultery by execution? He knows his listeners will understand. This is pretty heavy, devastating stuff. So you would expect that if this is the first time anyone has ever heard this, the first time anyone has ever given an ethical assessment or evaluation of what had been going on repeatedly, people who hear this should be shocked. And indeed they were. Verse 10, the disciples said to him, if this is the situation between a husband and a wife, it is better not to marry. That is the most pathetic thing that you could possibly imagine. Why? Well, here's what the disciple, this isn't the Pharisee, these are the disciples, which includes most of the people that were sent out by Jesus, etc., and evangelized people to begin the church. And you've read some of their publications. They're contained in the New Testament. Here's what they're saying. Well, if you're going to make the rule so that you can't get out of marriage and into a new one whenever you want, who in their right mind would ever get married in the first place? That's pathetic. Let me repeat. What they're saying is, if it's going to be that hard to get out of marriage and into another one, who in their right mind would ever want to get married in the first place? Does that sound like Genesis 1 and 2 perspective on marriage? And remember, the guys who are saying this are not the Pharisees who were against Jesus. It would have been outrageous if they had said it too, and maybe they thought it. But these are the guys who are supposed to be on Jesus' team in training, and this is their response. So, in effect, it's pretty clear, isn't it, that the disciples really wanted the Hillel position on Deuteronomy 24 and the meaning of ervat devar to be the right one, because if that was right, then you could get in and out of marriages any old time. It would be easy. And now what Jesus is saying is, no, actually the rule is harder than what either the Hillel or even the Shammai have said. Because the Shammai had said the only ground for divorce was adultery, but they'd never said you couldn't remarry if you divorced on some other ground. And the reason is pretty easy to understand in that culture. If you divorce a woman and she can't remarry, how's she going to support her family? As we said yesterday, your only options are begging on the street or prostitution. So it was naturally assumed that if you were divorced, regardless of the reason or cause, you would naturally remarry. At least the woman would. And it was expected that the man would as well, because it was, I think, pretty well known that the reason for divorcing is you wanted another wife, not because you wanted to be the single bachelor with a swinging bachelor pad. You wanted another wife. And now Jesus says, you know what, men and women, when you do that sort of thing, you're committing adultery. No one had ever said that before. And adulterers are supposed to be stoned to death. And realizing what that means in terms of whether they can get divorced and remarried, any number of times the apostles say, well, if you're going to make the rules that tough, who in their right mind would ever want to get married? That's pathetic. And I hope there's no one here who holds that sort of view. I hope there's no one in your churches who hold that sort of view. If you think there might be, you really need to start preaching on the biblical concept of marriage. Because if people think marriage it's an important decision, but it's not really that serious. And so if you get rid of your wife or your husband and you move on to another, it's no big thing. Well, surely in our secular society, it isn't any big thing. And that's just another problem with our secular society. In God's eyes, it's a very big thing. Well, then Jesus says in verse 11, Jesus replied, "Not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it has been given." Now, the crucial issue is, to what does Jesus refer when he says this teaching? There are a couple of options, and I hope you're going to see by the time we're done that the first one is not the option to choose. The first option is that this teaching is Jesus' teaching in verse 9. So he's just laid out the rules on divorce and remarriage. And the disciples are outraged, and they say, well, if those are the rules, who would be married? And Jesus, hearing their resistance, is saying, well, not everyone can accept this teaching, but only those to whom it has been given. In other words, I've given you the rules, and if you can live with it, good. If you can't, then just ignore them. Now how likely is it that Jesus would be doing that? Here are the rules. Here are the punishments. If you can live within that, then do so. If you can't, then ignore it. If that's what Jesus is saying, this is the only place that I can think of in the Gospels where Jesus gives the teaching and then says, take it or leave it. It's not what he's saying. Well, what is this teaching then, or this saying? What he's referring to is the disciples' reaction. Well, what is their reaction? It is better not to marry. In other words, you'd be better staying single. Now, if that's what Jesus is talking about, There should be some way in the passage to confirm this, shouldn't there? Besides just the absurdity of saying Jesus is referring to the rule he's just given. Well, lo and behold, when in doubt, read on to the next verse. That usually helps. And verse 12 begins with gar, for an explanatory gar, which means verse 12 is going to elaborate what Jesus has said in verse 11. So depending on what he talks about in verse 12, we're going to see whether in verse 11 he's talking about verse 9, his teaching, or verse 10, the disciples' reaction. For some are eunuchs because they were born that way, others were made that way by men, and others have renounced marriage because of the kingdom of heaven. The one who can accept this should accept it. Now, how does being a eunuch relate to Jesus' teaching in verse 9? Which is not about rules for eunuchs, it's about rules for married people. But now, would these comments about eunuchs be relevant to verse 10? You bet it would be, because it's clear that eunuchs normally are single. Jesus is using eunuchs as a symbol for single people. And he's saying someone might be single then for one purpose or another. The one who can accept this, what? Being a eunuch and hence being single, should accept it. And the word in the original for accept means not just you can agree with it, but you can agree with it in a way that you could actually live it. Class, Jesus is not saying, here's the rules on divorce and remarriage. And if you think those are good and you can handle it, good. And if not, just discard them. No, Jesus is not giving a rule and discarding it. The disciples are outraged by this, and Jesus picks up on their comment, it is better to remain single, and says, well, not everybody can do that. I mean, some of us psychologically, physically, whatever, really need to be married. There's some people who don't have to, and, there might be reasons that they don't. And if you're one of those people, then that's fine. Stay single. But not everyone can handle being single. So they shouldn't feel that they can't marry. But what they should know is if they do marry, they had better not divorce on grounds of anything other than porneia. Because if you do, you're most naturally in that day and age going to remarry, and you will have committed adultery, and you know what happens to adulterers and adulteresses. So, class, I believe that this does give a ground for divorce, though it doesn't require divorce. Since divorce is allowed, permitted, when it happens, remarriage is permitted because the ground for the divorce broke the bond. Now, it would be better if the couple could reconcile and not divorce and no remarriage, but you're permitted to go the whole route. So if the marriage bond was broken and you formalize that by divorcing, when you marry someone else, you are forging another marriage bond, but it's not one that is contradicting the first one. I mean, it's not that you're married to wife 2 and you're having sex with someone else who's not your wife. Let me stop and ask if you have any questions. We'll take a few minutes to do this, then we'll take a break, and then when we come back, we're going to turn to 1 Corinthians 7 and see what Paul says about divorce. Yes?
Would there be other grounds for divorce implicitly, like on what God establishes a marriage is. Like, for example, God says one man, one woman. So say there's no exception clause to this, but implicitly, like, if someone's married to 3 women, and say he gets saved or something, he's married to 3 women, wouldn't the fact is only, like, married to one man and one woman, divorcing the other 2 would be an exception? Or say, for example, he's married to a man. You know, he got married to a man. That's not even it's one man, one woman. Wouldn't divorce in that case be implicitly allowed in the case that it's not even the real marriage in God's sight, like the 3 women or the 1 man?
Okay, could you concisely repeat that so that I can repeat it for the people who are listening online and for others? This is a very good and important question, so I want to make sure that I'm clear about what it is and everybody else knows what we're answering.
In God's eyes, a marriage is one man and one woman.
Right.
Even though there's no like exception clause for this, would a man being married to 3 women be grounds for 2 divorces with the 2 women that he married after his first wife, or if he was married to a man, not a legitimate marriage in God's sight, would that be a ground for divorce? Kind of like the men who in Ezra's day like they divorced their wives and married other women, and God said, put away the women you married and go back to your wives, kind of like something like that.
Okay, let me see if I can concisely say that. Given that marriage seems to be presented clearly in Scripture as one man, one woman, and I'm sure you mean at a time. I mean, or you're not meaning one man, one woman forever, so that someone who was widowed or a widower couldn't remarry. What you're meaning is basically one person at a time. Then the question is, would then, if they marry a second and a third person, whatever the circumstances were, wouldn't that violate that biblical perspective on marriage? And if someone were to try, if a man were to try to marry another man, or a woman marry a woman, wouldn't that violate biblical teaching on marriage? Yes, but it needs some explanation, because I think there may be, your point is in general and in a lot of the specifics correct, but I think it needs perhaps a little bit of tweaking. And thank you for asking the question, because it does show, it allows me to show that one of the implications of what Jesus is saying in verse 9 is that polygamy is totally ruled out. Why is that important? Well, read the Old Testament and see how many of the people mentioned there have multiple wives, and on top of that, concubines. Now, how's that going to run with what Jesus says in Matthew 19:9? One of the things that this teaching of Jesus in verse 9 rules out is polygamy. You cannot have more than one spouse at a time, which would put a crimp in the lifestyle of a lot of Jesus' contemporaries. Okay, so that's number one. Given this teaching, the question always has to be, what is the status, it has to be, what is the status of the marital bond that is first established? What is the status of that in God's eyes? If the husband divorces his first wife on the grounds of ervat davar and then gets married a second time, the divorce was a sin and the remarriage was another sin. He committed adultery by doing that. If he divorced his first spouse on the grounds of porneia, in whatever form, then the divorce was not a sin. The act by his spouse that precipitated the divorce was surely sinful. But the husband, let's say, if it's the wife who commits the porneia, the husband, by divorcing her, he doesn't commit a sin. And since the porneia broke the marriage bond and now he's formalized that by a divorce, if he gets married a second time, he's not committing adultery, so that's okay. But now, if he's married a second time and then decides, I'm tired of her, I want to divorce her. In other words, if he divorces her on grounds of ervat davar, not on grounds of porneia, then the divorce in the second place is wrong. And if he remarries, he does commit adultery. But if he divorces her on grounds of porneia, that's not a sin. And so he could remarry a third time. You see, you can't just simply say, well, in general, all of this is wrong. No, you've got to ask yourself, what is the story? And by that I mean, what's the story that explains why each divorce occurred? And as we hear that story, we've got to ask ourselves, does the ground of divorce that was used in this case break the marriage bond in God's eyes? And if it doesn't, then he sinned to divorce, and remarriage commits another sin. If the act that precipitated the divorce does break the marriage bond, then the divorce is not a sin, and a remarriage wouldn't be. So you've got to keep your mind on what is the status of that marriage bond, and then you've got to listen to the story and the grounds for divorce and ask yourself, is that a ground the Scripture allows for divorce, or isn't it? I mean, once you learn the rules and how to do this, it's kind of like keeping score. It's obviously much more serious than that. But what I'm saying is trying to figure out, when a couple comes to you, he's been married and divorced, she's been married and divorced, they fall in love with one another, they come to you and ask you to marry them, you don't have to throw up your hands and say, oh, I don't know what I could do. No, you've got to sit down and listen to both of the stories and figure out whether either of them had a right to get divorced. And if their divorces were not sins, then a remarriage would not be a sin. And so if you hold this view, you could go ahead and remarry. Now, someone, and I hope none of you will do this, I feel pretty confident you won't, but someone could hear these rules and say, oh, okay, you know, I can manipulate the rules to my advantage. So if I get tired of my wife, and I want to get out of the marriage, and there's some other woman I really think is neat, and she thinks I'm neat, and I'd like to be married to her, well then, if I go out and commit adultery with whomever, then there is porneia, and that'll make my wife mad enough to divorce me, and when she does, she and I will both be free to remarry, and then I can marry this other one. Well, yeah, that's working within the rules, right? But it shows that there's something pretty perverse about the person who's using the rules to do evil. And class, this is why it's important not only to ask about the morality of the act, but about the morality of the agent in doing the act, right? So that if some couple came to me and wanted to be remarried, and they got into this situation because the guy who's going to be the husband did that to his first wife, I'm going to say, wait a minute. Before I can even think about possibly remarrying you, we need to talk about what you have done and why you've done it and what the rules are. and what God thinks about manipulating the rules for your own benefit. And well, then what does that mean? You wouldn't marry him. You tell him, go back to your first wife. Well, what if she's remarried? Well, then tell him go back and break up her second marriage and then no, 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 no. Because her second remarriage has established a marriage bond with the second husband, and she has a right to do that because she divorced him, the first husband, on grounds of porneia. And her motivation was not so that she could get on to another husband. No, you don't try to break up a marriage to undo, you don't try to undo one wrong by doing something else that's wrong. Okay, let's take a few others. In the back row, and then.
Based on his question, a Muslim has 4 wives.
Pardon me?
Based on his question earlier,
Yes.
a Muslim has 4 wives,
Okay.
becomes Christian.
Right.
All of them. Based on what you just said, how would you go about that?
Yeah. I think that is one of the more difficult things to deal with. And it was not uncommon that early Christians faced that kind of issue. And, you know, obviously that situation, let me repeat the question. The question was, a lot of Muslims, let's say, have 4 wives. Clearly, there's a problem, biblically speaking. What should they do? Should the Muslim, if he gets convinced about biblical teaching, divorce 3 of them? Regardless of what his religion is, let's say he's a Mormon and has multiple wives, and finally gets enlightened that you're not allowed to have multiple wives. Well, what should he do? This shows you how messy the situation can get when you start walking down the road of sin. I think I don't have biblical argument to prove conclusively, but I do think this is a case where you have to say this was wrong and definitely don't get a few more wives or any more. But, you know, some things, as the saying goes, you can't unscramble an egg. When something has been done, does that mean that it would be morally justified to divorce 3 of those? Well, if you didn't have grounds of porneia to divorce 3 of the 4, then you shouldn't divorce them. Say, but if you continue living with all 4 wives, that's sin as well. Yeah, but he didn't realize it. Now he does. And he should repent of having committed that sin. And you say, but if he repents of it, but he doesn't throw out 3 of them, doesn't he continue to sin and he needs to repent all the time? Well, I'm not sure. I mean, the question is, you recognize that this is a sin. Now, what can we do to rectify the situation? Commit another sin by divorcing wives without grounds of porneia? In a situation like that, I think a case can be made not to divorce them. Definitely don't get any more wives, but don't divorce them, but realize you have committed a sin in getting into that situation. And as those wives pass away, if they do, don't replace them. Well, you may say, but look, if he's got 4 wives, he's clearly committing porneia because he's committing adultery against one of the marriages every time. Okay, so the 4 women have grounds for divorce. I think you could say, if all of you understand the rules now. And because adultery has been committed by not only the husband, but all the women, because they're having sex with someone who's also married to someone else, I suppose you could say, well, all right, then on that ground we'll divorce you. But what if none of the four want to do that? I mean, it's a very sticky situation. You can see that in a fallen world, you can really get yourself into some huge messes. I know that's not a conclusive answer. The only thing I can appeal to biblically is don't think that because Solomon had all of these wives and concubines and God didn't tell him to divorce a bunch of them, that that meant God approved it. God just didn't get unhappy with polygamy in the New Testament era. I mean, please, God's omniscient. He knows what the rules are. But the fact that he didn't demand that even Abraham get rid of the handmaids like Hagar and other people, you say, well, he did say, cast out the bondwoman. Yeah, but not on the ground that polygamy was wrong, on another ground. And there were other handmaids that Sarah had who probably functioned as concubines to Abraham. And though God knew that wasn't right, and they should have known it was wrong, but again, remember, at that point in Abraham's life, the book of Genesis hasn't been written, so where's he going to read that? But nonetheless, God does not tell them, get rid of your wives. So now that we understand that it's sinful, that doesn't mean, okay, so we should also get rid of our wives. It's hard to know what to do. Let me take one more question from someone in this section and then one over there, and then let's take a break. Yes. Yes, I'm sorry.
With porneia not being specific, adultery, rather sexual impropriety, it's broader.
Which does include adultery.
Yes.
Okay.
Would pornography be included in a modern context that we're living in? Would pornography be a part of that?
Pornography, how? I mean, if pornography exists, but you and I never look at it.
Meaning the spouse is
Okay.
addicted or, of course, practice.
Well, I think one could make a case that it is because it involves lust after people who you're not married to, and Jesus says, if you lust after a woman in your heart, you've committed adultery, even though you haven't gone through the act. So I suppose that a wife who knew that her husband was heavily into pornography could divorce him on the grounds of porneia. But I suspect that because he hasn't actually done the act, if he's willing to get help, she'll probably say, let's recommit to one another and you get help and I won't divorce you. Because remember, when porneia has been committed, you don't have to divorce the person. You can, but you're not required to. Remember, verse 9 is not a command, it's a moral evaluation of what your acts actually are doing. Okay, one question over here, to be fair. Yes, brother.
I sort of had a couple,
Okay.
but I wanted you to clarify something you just said about, were you kind of encouraging that if somebody was married to multiple wives that they consider that as an option? Or are you just saying you would lay it out like everyone needs to repent of it, and if you choose to do this, it's okay? And the other thing was, I thought he asked a question earlier about homosexuals.
Yes.
That one seems easier to resolve, because it seems like it would be a marriage. But the other one was on, is there anything in the New Testament about, let's say something else like incest, with, like, let's say a close relative? I mean, I know these are rare cases, but what would you do in those situations? And were you encouraging the divorce? Were you saying that to suggest as a possible resolution in the case of polygamy?
Yes, thank you. There's actually a couple of things there, as you said. One was I haven't yet commented on the earlier question about a gay marriage, quote unquote. Um, and then also in the polygamy case, am I suggesting that one should divorce several of his wives to get down to one? Let me answer the first part of that about a gay marriage. I would say that if someone is married, if a man is married to a woman and he starts having sex with some other man, whether they try to formalize this or not in a marriage, the crucial thing here, in a way, is to see that to divorce that other man shouldn't be sinful, because God doesn't recognize that there can be a marriage bond between two men or between two women in the first place. So in that case, I think you should encourage those men to stop the relationship. Now, if they're not willing, then the wife of the one man is probably going to say, well, definitely porneia has been committed and I've got grounds for divorce, and since he's unwilling to change and try to reform, I am going to go ahead and divorce him, and she's allowed to, and she would be allowed to remarry. So that's what I would want to say. Now, again, what we're saying is this is an assessment from the perspective of whether God sees that these people are married or not from the perspective of what the state will now allow. You can get the marriage license in certain states if you're gay. That doesn't mean that God recognizes that there's a marriage bond that actually exists there. As to the polygamy thing, what I'm saying, what I was basically saying there, and I apologize if it wasn't clear, is I was basically trying to show you that there's more than one way that you could go about handling that. And what I wanted to say, but clearly didn't say it clear enough, is that I'm not sure exactly which would be the best thing to do. I think this is a case where you've got a number of things that you could do which would be morally permissible. You can't do all of them together. And I think you've got to figure this is one of those cases where the rules are not going to entirely allow you to decide what to do. So you're probably going to have to start looking at some consequences. What would it mean for this person and for 3 of his wives if he divorced them? And also for the children that he has with those wives. What would it mean if he stayed married to all of them? It's just really hard. And this question is not an ethereal ivory tower academic question, because there are some of you who are going to be missionaries in Africa, and you're going to minister to some primitive tribes where the custom has been polygamy, but they were never saved before, and they're going to hear the gospel and accept Christ, and they're going to learn that polygamy is wrong, and then you're going to have to talk. You're going to have to talk with them, and you're first of all going to have to think and pray about what should we tell these folk who have multiple wives to do, especially in this culture. I mean, in one of those cultures, a woman may have less opportunity to support herself if she's on her own than a woman has in our culture. These are not easy things. I would suggest, for whatever it's worth, if there are professors on the Master Seminary faculty who have been missionaries in that sort of situation, I'm positive they've run into that. And I would ask them what they suggested and what they did. I would also suggest, there are obviously professors at other seminaries. The man who is dean at Trinity, Dr. T. Tianu, is from Burkina Faso, which I forget what that used to be called. But at any rate, he grew up and lived in that area. He ministers there quite a lot. Anything you'd want to know about anything in Africa, he'd be the guy to ask. And his field is missions, but specifically theology of missions. He's a pretty good theologian as well as a missiologist. Someone like that, I think you could get a lot of information on what he has seen has actually happened and what missionaries have suggested when they have evangelized tribes where people came to Christ, but before that they had multiple wives. So, yeah.
I was going to wait to hear the incest question.
Yeah, the incest issue, obviously, porneia covers incest.
What I mean is like in 1 Corinthians 5, when it says a man has his father's wife, is the father still alive at that time? I mean, or is there issues on incest in the New Testament? Is there any teaching on it? So that if a person was married to someone in his close family, would that be a marriage anew to be dissolved?
Yeah, I think so. You're not to commit incest. And I think if you are involved in a relationship, even a marriage where you're committing incest and you have biblical teaching portrayed to you, and let's say you accept Christ, I think you would have either one of two options. Either mutually agree to dissolve the marriage, or if you're unwilling to do that, then you've got to then say, okay, we will both commit to total abstinence. Living in the home without sex relations, you're not actually committing incest in the technical sense of the word. As I say, this is one of those hard cases. We get ourselves into sin, and sometimes it's very hard to get out of it. Now, you might say, well, what if they got into this marriage before they became Christians? Does that mean it's okay to go on as husband and wife and have sex relations? No, it doesn't. So it seems to me either continue the marriage with total abstinence, not only in regard to your spouse, but in regard to anyone else. Or I think if both mutually agree that this is wrong, both of them have committed porneia, so either one of them would have a ground to divorce the other. And if divorce is okay, then we're saying remarriage is as well.